The plate lands with a quiet clink, but the weight of it hits harder than china should. Half a chicken breast, meticulously trimmed, 3 limp green beans, a spoonful of mashed potatoes without gravy. Smaller portions are better at your age. Mom, her daughter says with a smile that splits like glass under pressure. This is how dignity dies, not with a thunderous argument, but with a precisely measured meal, with chore charts color-coded in pastels, with conversations that happen around you, not with you, with the slow, suffocating certainty that the home you paid for has become a cage built of small courtesies and surgical diminishments. There are wars fought with bullets and bombs. Then there are wars fought across dining room tables, in doctor's appointments made without consent, in the casual way someone enters your space without knocking. But remember, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who shouts. It's the one who has been silent so long, they've forgotten the sound of their own voice until the day they remember. The plate landed in front of Margaret Reynolds with a quiet clink, but the weight of it hit harder than china should. Half a chicken breast, precisely trimmed, 3 green beans, limp and cold, a spoonful of mashed potatoes without gravy. Smaller portions are better at your age. Mom, Olivia said with a bright smile that tried to pass as thoughtful but split like glass under pressure. We don't want your blood pressure going haywire, right? The words slid across the table like a warning. The others barely noticed, too busy with second helpings and full glasses of red wine. Brian was already digging into his second helping, knife slicing through meat with relish. Their twins, Ethan and Emma, passed a basket of garlic rolls between them, warm and steaming, without once glancing her way. Margaret Maggie to her friends, Mom to her daughter, and increasingly Grandma, even when the children weren't around, sat still, her fork hovering over the green beans. Then came the laugh, a short chorus-like chuckle from the table, as if Olivia had landed a punchline they'd all rehearsed. Brian smirked and said, "You know how your mom is. Depression-era stomach 1 ration per meal." That was the moment, not when the fork dropped, not when the wine bottle emptied, but right then, when her own daughter called her elderly without saying the word, and her son-in-law turned it into sport. Maggie forced a tight smile, pushed the food around her plate, and said nothing, but something hardened in her chest, like soil packed too tight for anything new to grow. Later that night, long after the dishwasher had stopped humming and the house had dimmed into silence, she sat cross-legged on the floor of her in-law suite, a manila envelope open beside her. The air still held the scent of lemon soap and rosemary chicken, the good rosemary, the kind she used to grow in her old backyard before she sold the house. She didn't sleep. She sorted every document she'd kept since the sale of her home, neatly labeled in clear plastic sleeves closing statements, wire transfer receipts, emails between realtors. She flipped through them with slow precision, like a teacher reviewing student papers, trained to find what others overlook. Then she pulled out the house contract, the big one, 42 pages, signed and notarized in bold blue ink. Her heart beat louder the further she flipped, not out of fear, out of memory. Page 6, line 3, title holder Margaret Ann Reynolds. Her name, no co-owners, no co-signers, just her. She sat back against the bed and exhaled. They'd made her feel like a guest in their home. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was stashed in a filing cabinet. The truth was paid in full by her. 2 years and 7 months earlier, Maggie had stood in her garden on Maple Street, secateurs in hand, clipping roses for the kitchen table. The garden had been her sanctuary since Richard passed 5 years before each bloom, a testament to her refusal to wither in widowhood. At 62, Margaret Reynolds had found her rhythm in retirement. 30 years of teaching high school English had given her both a pension and a profound appreciation for quiet mornings. The house on Maple Street wasn't large, but it was paid off, comfortable, and entirely hers. The phone rang from inside. She recognized Olivia's ringtone. "Mom!" Olivia's voice sounded strained. "Are you sitting down? I'm standing in the garden. What's wrong?" "Brian lost his job. The whole department was cut." Maggie lowered herself onto the garden bench. "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. It gets worse. I was going to tell you this weekend, but I'm pregnant." The secateurs clattered to the ground. "That's wow." "That's not worse. That's Mom. We can barely afford the twins' after-school activities. The mortgage is underwater. And now, a third child? We're drowning." Maggie listened as Olivia cycled through panic and plans. She heard the desperation build with each word, felt her daughter's fear like a physical presence across the phone line. "What if we sold both houses?" Olivia finally suggested. "Yours and ours. We could pool resources, buy something with an in-law suite for you, one mortgage, shared expenses, built-in childcare. Live together." Maggie repeated, watching a monarch butterfly land on her prized moonlight roses. It would be perfect, Mom. You'd have your own space, but we'd be there if you need us, and you'd see the kids every day. The butterfly lifted off, carried away by a breeze that suddenly felt colder than it should in May. Let me think about it, Maggie said. But even as she spoke, she knew what her answer would be. Mothers didn't watch their children drown. The realtor hammered the sold sign into Maggie's front lawn with 3 swift strokes. Each one felt like a nail in the coffin of her independence. Congratulations, the woman said, all teeth and commission calculations. Cash offers always win in this market. You're one smart lady. Maggie nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. 38 years in this house. 2 children raised within its walls. Richard's last breath drawn in the master bedroom upstairs, all of it reduced to a check and a closing date. Mom, this is happening. Olivia appeared beside her, squeezing her arm. I've already found the perfect place. 4 bedrooms, a gorgeous garden space, and a completely separate in-law suite with its own entrance. You'll love it. Love wasn't the emotion Maggie felt as she walked back into her soon-to-be former home. The emotion was closer to vertigo, the disorienting sensation of stepping off solid ground into uncertainty. That night, she began the arduous task of sorting 4 decades of accumulated life. Each object presented a question: keep, sell, donate, trash. The mundane mingled with the precious kitchen utensils, with Richard's love letters, tax returns with family photo albums. She worked methodically, box by box, room by room, refusing help from well-meaning friends. This was her life to disassemble, her grief to process again. Eleanor Wright, her oldest friend and former colleague, arrived unannounced on the 3rd day with Chinese takeout and wine. I heard about the sale, Eleanor said, settling into the living room armchair that would soon belong to strangers. Are you sure about this, Mags? Maggie poured the wine into mismatched mugs, the good glasses already packed. Olivia needs me. And what about what you need? Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. You've built a life here, your garden, your book club, your volunteer work at the library. I'll still have those things. Will you living under someone else's roof, following someone else's rules? Maggie bristled. It's not like that. I'll have my own space, and my name will be on the deed. We've already discussed it. Eleanor's eyebrows rose. Get that in writing, dear. Family promises have a way of evolving. Olivia would never take advantage. I've been a divorce attorney for 30 years. Maggie, I've seen what financial pressure does to good people. Eleanor leaned forward. Just promise me you'll protect yourself. Maggie nodded, more to end the conversation than in agreement. Eleanor meant well, but she didn't understand. This wasn't a sacrifice. It was an investment in family. What could be more important than that? The yard sale attracted neighbors Maggie hadn't seen in years, all curious about the sold sign and the impending move. Downsizing? Mrs. Abernathy asked, fingering a crystal vase. Moving in with my daughter, Maggie replied, marking down prices on a sheet of notebook paper. They're expecting their third, and they need the help. Oh, how lovely, Mrs. Abernathy said, but her eyes telegraphed something different. Pity, perhaps, or warning. Maggie spent the morning haggling over the pieces of her life. The oak dining table that had hosted 20 Thanksgiving dinners went for $100 to a young couple just starting out. Richard's tools, untouched in the garage since his death, were claimed by the Henderson boy, who'd always stopped to admire Richard's carpentry. By mid-afternoon, the lawn was nearly empty. Maggie sat on the porch steps, surveying what remained: a few paperbacks, some kitchen gadgets, a collection of Christmas ornaments no one wanted. A car pulled into the driveway. Jessica, her niece, her late brother's only child, stepped out, her college sweatshirt bright against the gray day. Aunt Maggie, she called, navigating through the yard sale remnants. I came as soon as I heard. Are you really selling? Jessica had always been more like a daughter than a niece, especially after her father's death when she was just 15. Maggie had stepped in, guiding her through high school, college applications, heartbreaks, now 23 and starting graduate school. Jessica had her father's steady gaze and her aunt's stubborn chin. The closing is next week, Maggie confirmed. Jessica surveyed the emptying lawn. And you're okay with this, moving in with Olivia and Brian? It makes sense financially, and I'll have my own space. That's what they all say, Jessica muttered, kicking at a pebble. Then it's just until we get on our feet, or just until we find something else. And 5 years later, you're still in the basement. It's not a basement. It's a proper in-law suite. Jessica's eyes softened. I know you want to help them, but you love this house, your garden, your independence. Sometimes we make choices for the people we love, Maggie said, surprised by the defensiveness in her voice. Jessica didn't argue further. Instead, she helped pack the unsold items for donation, worked alongside Maggie in comfortable silence. As they labeled the final boxes, Jessica paused. Just make sure you're legally protected. Okay, get everything in writing. Maggie felt a flicker of irritation. First Eleanor, now Jessica. Olivia is my daughter. This isn't a business transaction. Jessica's smile was sad. Family can be the most complicated business of all. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning in early September. Maggie sat in the lawyer's office, pen poised over the stack of documents that would transfer ownership of her home of nearly 4 decades to a young family from Chicago. She'd met them once, bright-eyed, expecting their first child, full of plans for renovating the kitchen and turning Richard's study into a nursery. The wife had gushed over the garden, promising to maintain Maggie's beloved roses. Maggie had nodded and smiled, trying to be gracious while her heart splintered. Now, watching the final papers slide across the mahogany desk, she felt a moment of pure panic. Was she making a terrible mistake? Mrs. Reynolds, the lawyer prompted, "We need your signature here. And here." She signed, her hand surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her chest. The deed was done. The proceeds would be wired to her account by end of day, a substantial sum that reflected both the original purchase price and the decades of appreciation. Most of it would go toward the new house, where Olivia and Brian were already in contract negotiations. Outside the office, Olivia waited, tapping on her phone. She looked up as Maggie emerged. "All done?" she asked, eyes bright with anticipation. Maggie nodded, unable to speak. Olivia hugged her, quick and perfunctory. "This is the right decision, Mom. You'll see. We're going to make such a wonderful home together." But as they drove away, Maggie couldn't help looking back at the law office, where the keys to her past had just been surrendered. She'd sold more than a house today. She'd sold certainty. The new house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood of similar homes, all two-story colonials, with manicured lawns and tasteful landscaping. It was newer than Maggie's old place, built in the early 2000s rather than the 1950s, with an open floor plan and large windows that flooded the rooms with light. Olivia led the tour, gesturing expansively. 4 bedrooms upstairs for us and the kids, office space for Brian on the main floor, and here, she opened a door off the kitchen, your suite. The in-law space was generous, a bedroom, small sitting area, private bath, and a sliding door that led to a patio and the backyard beyond. It had been staged with neutral furniture that would be removed before move-in. "You'll be able to decorate however you want," Olivia continued, "and you'll have complete privacy when you want it." Maggie nodded, trying to picture her life contained within these walls. The space was lovely, but it was not a home. Not yet. "The garden area needs work," Brian acknowledged, gesturing to the backyard visible through the glass door. "But I know you'll make it spectacular. Margaret." She bristled slightly at his use of her full name. Only Richard had called her Margaret, and even then, only when he was being serious. Everyone else called her Maggie. "What about the deed?" she asked, pulling her attention back to practical matters. "How will that work with both families?" Brian and Olivia exchanged a quick glance. "Actually," Brian began, his voice taking on the careful tone he used when explaining financial matters to the twins. "The bank said it's cleaner if only one name is on the mortgage, since your credit score is excellent and you're putting down the bulk of the down payment." "You want my name on the deed," Maggie clarified. "Just for the paperwork," Olivia assured her. "It's still our house, all of us. We'll have a separate legal agreement about shared ownership. The lawyer is drawing it up." Maggie felt a twinge of unease. "I'd like to review that agreement before we close." "Of course," Brian said quickly. "But we need to move fast on this place. The sellers have another offer coming in." Pressure tactics. Maggie recognized them from her years of committee work at school. Create urgency, push for a quick decision, minimize concerns. "I'll need to speak with my own lawyer," she said firmly. Brian's smile tightened. "Absolutely. But maybe just a quick review. We don't want to lose this house, and time is of the essence." Maggie looked around the space again. It was beautiful, and Olivia looked so hopeful, her hand absently cradling her still flat stomach where Maggie's newest grandchild grew. "I'll call Eleanor today," she conceded. "She can expedite the review." Relief washed over Olivia's face. "Thanks, Mom. You're going to love it here. I promise." As they left, Maggie lingered in the doorway of what would be her suite, trying to imagine the space filled with her remaining possessions. It could work, she told herself. It had to. Eleanor's office was cluttered with the organized chaos of a legal mine stacks of files, legal tomes, and framed family photos competing for space on every surface. This is a terrible idea, Eleanor declared, peering over her reading glasses at the draft agreement Brian had sent over. Maggie sighed. I didn't come here for a lecture. I need you to review the legal document. I'm reviewing it, and legally speaking, it's a mess. Eleanor flipped a page. This isn't a co-ownership agreement, Maggie. It's a vague statement of intention with no binding power. What does that mean? It means if things go south, you'll have no recourse. Your name is on the deed and mortgage, but this agreement gives Olivia and Brian implied equity without any of the legal responsibility. Eleanor removed her glasses. Why are they rushing this? Brian lost his job. Olivia's pregnant. They're underwater on their current mortgage. So you're the bailout plan, Maggie bristled. I'm helping my family. At what cost? Your security, your independence. Eleanor's voice softened. I've known you for 30 years, Maggie. You've always been the one to sacrifice for others. But you're 62. You need to think about your own future. I am. My future is with my family. Eleanor closed the file. Then at least let me draft a proper agreement, one that protects everyone's interests and spells out what happens if God forbid things don't work out. Maggie hesitated. Will that offend them? If they're being honest, no. If they're trying to take advantage, yes. Eleanor fixed her with a steady gaze. Which do you think it is? They would never take advantage, Maggie insisted, but a seed of doubt had been planted. But yes, draft something proper. Just be diplomatic. Eleanor nodded, already reaching for her legal pad. I'll have it ready by tomorrow. And Maggie, don't sign anything else until you've read this version. The closing for the new house took place 3 weeks later in the same law office where Maggie had sold her home. This time, Olivia and Brian flanked her at the table, their expressions a mix of excitement and barely concealed anxiety. The draft agreement Eleanor had prepared sat in Maggie's purse, unsigned. She'd shown it to Brian and Olivia the night before, and their reaction had been telling polite dismay, followed by assurances that they would review it later, after the closing. Now, as the closing attorney slid the final paperwork across the table, Maggie felt that same flutter of panic she'd experienced when selling her house. The mortgage document listed only her name. The deed would show only her as owner. Mrs. Reynolds, if you'll sign here, the attorney indicated. She hesitated, pen hovering above the line. And the co-ownership agreement? The attorney looked confused. I don't have any co-ownership documents in the file. Brian cleared his throat. That's a separate agreement, between family members. We'll handle that privately. The attorney nodded, unconcerned. Maggie looked at Olivia, seeking reassurance. It's just paperwork, Mom, Olivia said softly. We're family. We'll sort everything out once we're settled. The seed of doubt Eleanor had planted sprouted another leaf. But what choice did she have back out now? And Olivia and Brian would lose their deposit. The house they'd all fallen in love with would go to someone else. And where would she go? Her own house was already sold, the new owners taking possession next week. She signed. The attorney smiled, gathering the documents. Congratulations, Mrs. Reynolds, you're the new owner. Owner. The word felt heavy, laden with responsibility and risk, not what she'd planned at all. Outside, Brian clapped his hands together. We did it, house of our dreams. Secured. Olivia hugged Maggie. Thank you, Mom, for everything. Maggie hugged her back, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that she'd just made a colossal mistake. When do we move in? The movers are scheduled for next Tuesday. Brian answered. You'll be settled in your new suite by dinner time. Her new suite, not her home, not anymore. Moving day arrived with unseasonable rain that turned cardboard boxes soggy and spirits damp. Maggie supervised the loading of her remaining possessions into a small moving truck, while across town, a larger truck handled Olivia and Brian's things. Jessica arrived mid-morning with coffee and donuts, her car already packed with fragile items Maggie didn't trust to the movers' photo albums. Richard's urn, her mother's china. How are you holding up? Jessica asked, passing Maggie a steaming cup. I'm fine, Maggie lied, watching the movers maneuver her reading chair through the front door, the last significant piece of furniture left in the house. Jessica didn't push. Instead, she linked her arm through Maggie's. Show me around one last time. They walked through the empty rooms, footsteps echoing on bare floors. In each space, Maggie paused, recounting a memory. This is where Richard built the twins' crib. Or, remember when we painted this room purple, and your dad was horrified. In the garden, she stood longest, eyes tracing the rose bushes she'd cultivated for decades. The new owners promised to take care of them. Gardens can be replanted, Jessica said gently. You'll make a new one. Maggie nodded, unconvinced. Some things couldn't be transplanted without loss. The final walkthrough was quick and impersonal. A real estate agent with a clipboard, checking off items, making sure Maggie had left the house in the condition promised. Keys handed over. Garage door opener surrendered. Security code shared. And then, suddenly, it was time to leave. Maggie stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the house where she'd lived most of her adult life, the place where she'd become a wife, a mother, a widow, and finally, herself. Ready? Jessica asked, car keys in hand. No, Maggie thought. I'll never be ready. But she nodded and got into the car. The new house buzzed with activity movers carrying furniture, Olivia directing traffic, Brian assembling beds upstairs, the twins racing through hallways exploring their new territory. Maggie stood in the center of her suite, surrounded by boxes labeled in her neat handwriting, kitchen clothes, books, Richard. How's it going in here? Olivia poked her head in, harried but smiling. Need help unpacking? I'm fine, Maggie said. Just getting oriented. I've got to run back to the old house to grab the last few things and clean up. Will you be okay here? I've been taking care of myself for a long time. Olivia? A flicker of something annoyance guilt crossed Olivia's face. Of course, Mom. I didn't mean... She was interrupted by Brian calling from upstairs. Gotta run. The pizza's coming at 6. Alone again. Maggie began the methodical process of turning the impersonal space into something that might feel like home. She unpacked books first, arranging them on the built-in shelves by the window. Then Richard's photographs, their wedding day, Olivia's graduation, the twins' birth. Finally, her clothes, hanging them neatly in the closet that was half the size of her old one. By dinner time, the suite looked lived in, if not quite comfortable. The furniture from her old house, what little she'd kept, seemed awkward in the new space, like actors on the wrong stage. Pizza arrived as promised. They ate in the kitchen, perched on boxes because the dining table hadn't been assembled yet. The twins were giddy with exhaustion. Brian distracted by his phone, Olivia making lists even as she chewed. We're thinking of painting the living room next weekend, Olivia announced. Something neutral but warm. What do you think, Mom? Maggie swallowed a bite of pizza. I like the color it is now. Oh, it's too dark. Makes the space feel smaller. We're thinking agreeable gray is perfect with the natural light. Brian looked up from his phone. Already ordered the paint. Guy at the store said it's their most popular color. And just like that, the decision was made, without her input. Despite the fact that her name was on the deed, her money had bought the house, and she would be living with that color choice every day. It was a small thing, insignificant in the grand scheme. But as Maggie retreated to her suite that night, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes and unfamiliar shadows, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The first month passed in a blur of adjustments. Maggie established new routines, morning coffee on her small patio, afternoon walks through the neighborhood, evenings reading in her armchair, while the chaos of family life continued on the other side of her door. Olivia's pregnancy progressed, her body softening and expanding. The twins settled into the new house with the adaptability of youth, quickly claiming favorite spots and establishing territories. Brian remained jobless but busy, spending hours on his laptop in the home office, occasionally emerging for meals or to take phone calls in hushed tones. Maggie planted a small garden in the back corner of the yard, nothing like her old one, but a start. Herbs, a few perennials, and one rose bush transplanted from her previous home. Brian had eyed the space dubiously. We were thinking of putting the playset there, he'd said. Better sun exposure for the kids. But Maggie had stood firm. There's plenty of yard. This corner is mine. A small victory, but it mattered. The first real conflict arose over the kitchen. Maggie had always enjoyed cooking, finding peace in the rhythms of chopping and stirring. One evening, she prepared a lasagna, her mother's recipe, rich with cheese and sausage. Olivia came home from a doctor's appointment, sniffed the air, and frowned. Oh, Mom, you didn't need to cook. We were going to order in. I wanted to, Maggie said, sliding the bubbling dish onto a trivet. It's my contribution to the household. Olivia's expression softened. That's sweet, but she gestured to her growing belly. I'm trying to watch my sodium. Doctor's orders, and Brian's been cutting back on dairy. One meal won't hurt, Maggie argued, the joy of cooking already fading. That night, Brian ate one small piece, complimenting it loudly while drinking extra water. Olivia picked at hers, separating cheese from sauce. Only the twins ate with gusto until Olivia reminded them about screen time limits, and they abandoned half-full plates for the lure of video games. Maggie wrapped the leftovers carefully, knowing they would sit untouched until she either ate them all or threw them away. The following week, a chore chart appeared on the refrigerator, color-coded and laminated, with each family member assigned specific tasks. Maggie's name appeared under dinner prep Mondays and light cleaning Thursdays. She stared at it during her morning coffee. "What's this? Just trying to get organized," Olivia explained, rushing through the kitchen with a travel mug. "We all need to contribute, right? Contribute, as if the house itself wasn't contribution enough." But Maggie said nothing, just sipped her coffee and added another mental tally to a growing list of small incursions. In October, Olivia came home with news. "Mom, I found the perfect doctor for you." Maggie looked up from her book. "I have a doctor, Dr. Michaels. I've been seeing him for 15 years. But he's all the way across town now. Dr. Chen is right here in the neighborhood, and she specializes in geriatric care." "Geriatric," Maggie repeated, the word landing like a slap. "I'm 62, not 82. Olivia backpedaled. "Senior health, then. She's really wonderful. I already made you an appointment for next week." The presumption was breathtaking. Maggie closed her book with deliberate calm. "I appreciate your concern, but I'll manage my own health care. Thank you." "Mom, be reasonable. You have high blood pressure. You need regular monitoring, and Dr. Chen is 5 minutes away. My blood pressure is managed with medication that Dr. Michaels prescribes. I'm perfectly capable of driving across town for appointments. But it makes more sense to have someone local." Olivia persisted. "Especially as you get older and might not want to drive as much." There it was again, the subtle suggestion that she was declining, becoming less capable. Maggie felt her carefully managed blood pressure rising. "Cancel the appointment," she said firmly. "I'm not changing doctors." Olivia's expression hardened. "Fine, but when you change your mind, don't expect Dr. Chen to have immediate openings. She's in high demand." After Olivia left, Maggie sat motionless, the conversation replaying in her head. It wasn't just about the doctor, it was about autonomy, about being treated as a competent adult rather than an aging dependent. She reached for her phone and dialed Eleanor. "How's communal living?" Eleanor asked by way of greeting. "Increasingly complicated," Maggie admitted. "I need that co-ownership agreement we discussed. The formal one, with clear boundaries." Eleanor's sigh carried through the phone line. "They still haven't signed it. They keep saying we'll get to it once things settle down." "Things never settle down, Maggie. That's how life works." A pause. "What happened?" Maggie recounted the doctor incident, then added other examples: the garden space negotiation, the kitchen tensions, the chore chart. "It's all so subtle," she concluded. "Nothing I can point to and say, that's wrong. Just a constant erosion of my independence. That's how it starts," Eleanor said grimly. "Small encroachments that seem reasonable in isolation, but add up to control." Another pause. "I'll send over the agreement again. This time, be firm about getting it signed. And if they refuse, then you have your answer about their intentions." After hanging up, Maggie sat in her armchair for a long time, watching shadows lengthen across her small patio. The roses she'd transplanted were struggling, their leaves yellowing at the edges. Not enough sun in this corner. Perhaps. Or maybe they, like her, were having trouble adapting to their new circumstances. Thanksgiving arrived with a flurry of preparations. Olivia, now visibly pregnant, orchestrated the holiday with military precision assignments distributed, timelines established, guest list curated. "Mom, you're on cranberry sauce and pie duty," she announced at breakfast. "And could you clear out some space in your fridge for the turkey? Our main one is packed." Maggie looked up from her toast. "My fridge? The one in your kitchenette. You hardly use it anyway." It was true that the small refrigerator in her suite was rarely full, but it was hers, one of the few spaces entirely under her control. "I'd prefer to keep my things separate," she said carefully. Olivia's expression flickered between surprise and annoyance. "It's just for a day or two. Mom, we're talking about a turkey, not a permanent arrangement." Put that way, refusal seemed petty. Maggie relented, as she had on a dozen small matters since moving in. Each concession individually reasonable, collectively suffocating. Thanksgiving Day dawned bright and cold. Maggie rose early to bake pies, pumpkin and apple, from recipes she'd used for decades. The familiar rituals soothed her, flour dusting her hands like memories. Guests began arriving at three Brian's parents, his sister and her husband, a colleague of Olivia's and her family. Maggie greeted them warmly, then retreated to the kitchen to help with final preparations. Mom, could you set the kids' table? Olivia asked, flustered and glowing in equal measure. Maggie paused. Kids' table, in the breakfast nook, for the twins and Melissa's children. Where will I sit? Olivia gestured vaguely toward the dining room. With the adults, of course. But when Maggie entered the dining room, she saw the table set for 10, with place cards at each setting. She found her name at the far end, wedged between Brian's taciturn father and the empty chair reserved for whoever would supervise the children's table. Not at the head, where she'd always sat for holiday meals. Not even in the middle, where conversation flowed easiest. At the end, like an afterthought. She said nothing, just adjusted the centerpiece and returned to the kitchen. Dinner itself was a cacophony of conversation, laughter, and occasional squabbles from the kids' table. Maggie smiled and passed dishes, answered polite questions about her garden and her volunteer work, complimented the turkey dry and the stuffing underseasoned. It wasn't until dessert that the facade cracked. Maggie, these pies are divine, Brian's sister exclaimed, taking a second slice of apple. You'll have to give me the recipe. Family secret, Maggie said with a genuine smile. But I'd be happy to bake one for you anytime. Mom makes the best pies, Olivia agreed. It's the one thing she hasn't had to give up as she's gotten older. The table didn't fall silent. Conversations continued around them, but Maggie felt a stillness settle in her chest. Give up, Olivia laughed lightly. You know what I mean? Some hobbies get harder with age, but baking is something you can do forever. I'm 62, Maggie said, her voice level, not infirm. Across the table, Brian's mother nodded sympathetically. It sneaks up on you, doesn't it? One day you're running marathons, the next you're grateful for a good nap. A murmur of amused agreement rippled through the adult table. Maggie felt herself being erased in real time, her identity replaced with a caricature of aging fragility. She stood, gathering empty plates. I think I'll check on the children. In the kitchen, away from the cheerful condescension of the dining room, Maggie leaned against the counter and took a deep breath, then another. Her hands trembled slightly as she scraped leftovers into containers. This was what Eleanor had warned her about, not a dramatic confrontation, but a slow, smiling subjugation. Death by 1,000 courtesies. Christmas brought more of the same. Maggie's ornaments, collected over decades of marriage and motherhood, were deemed too traditional for the modern aesthetic Olivia and Brian wanted. Her suggestion of baking cookies with the twins was met with concerns about sugar intake and scheduling conflicts. Even gift-giving became a minefield. Maggie's carefully chosen presents for the twins' books she'd selected based on their emerging interests were greeted with polite thanks, but quickly overshadowed by the electronic devices from their parents. You shouldn't have spent so much, Olivia chided when she opened her own gift, a cashmere sweater Maggie had saved for. You need to watch your budget now that you're on a fixed income. Fixed income. As if her pension and careful investments were somehow inadequate, as if she hadn't just contributed the bulk of the money for the very house they were sitting in. I manage my finances quite well, Maggie replied, smoothing the wrapping paper from her own gift, a subscription to a meal kit service for busy seniors. By New Year's, the pattern was clear. Each day brought some new small diminishment, some fresh reminder that her role had shifted from matriarch to dependent. Her boundaries were tested, then breached, then erased entirely. The in-law suite, once her sanctuary, was increasingly treated as communal space. Olivia entered without knocking to borrow a sweater. Brian used her patio for phone calls when he needed quiet. The twins treated her bookshelf as a lending library, returning volumes with bent pages and juice stains. We're family, Olivia said dismissively when Maggie suggested a closed-door policy. We don't stand on ceremony. But ceremony, the small rituals of respect and consideration, was exactly what was missing. January brought snow and a new development. Brian got a job offer, lower salary than before, but steady work with benefits. It's in Burlington, he announced over dinner. About an hour commute? That's too far, Olivia protested, one hand on her now prominent belly. Especially with the baby coming in March. Brian nodded. I know. That's why I'm thinking we should look at houses there. The market's better, and with my new salary and what we have saved. Maggie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Move! What about this house? Olivia and Brian exchanged a look, the kind that excluded her from whatever silent communication passed between them. We'd sell it, of course. Brian said smoothly. With the market as it is, we should make a tidy profit. Maggie repeated. My name is on the deed. I paid for most of it. And you'd get your share, Olivia assured her. Enough for a nice little condo near us in Burlington. Or, she hesitated. There are some really lovely retirement communities there. Retirement communities. The words hung in the air like a sentence. I'm not interested in moving again, Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt, especially not to a retirement community. Mom, be reasonable. Brian's commute is his problem, not mine. Maggie set down her fork. I sold my home to help you when you needed it. I'm not uprooting my life again because Brian's job situation has changed. Brian's expression hardened. We're talking about what's best for the family. Am I not part of this family? Maggie challenged. Or just a financial convenience to be moved around like furniture? Silence fell over the table. The twins glanced between the adults, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Of course you're family, Olivia finally said, her tone conciliatory. We'll figure something out. But as Maggie retreated to her suite that night, she knew a line had been crossed. The pretense of equal partnership had been exposed for what it was, a temporary arrangement of convenience. She reached for her phone and texted Jessica, Can you come over tomorrow? I need advice. Jessica's reply came immediately. On my way after work. Everything okay? Maggie stared at the screen, unsure how to answer. Was anything okay? She settled for, we'll talk tomorrow. Then she pulled out the manila folder that contained the house documents, the deed, the mortgage papers, the unsigned co-ownership agreement Eleanor had drafted months ago. She spread them on her small desk and began reading, looking for leverage, for protection, for a way out of the trap she'd walked into with eyes wide open but heart unwisely trusting. By morning, she had a plan, or at least the beginning of one. Jessica arrived at 5:30, letting herself in with a key Maggie had given her. She found her aunt in the garden, bundled against the January chill, pruning the struggling rose bush. You're going to freeze out here, Jessica called, hands thrust deep in her coat pockets. Maggie straightened, wincing as her back protested. Just trying to save this one. It was Richard's favorite. Inside the suite, Maggie made tea while Jessica shed layers of winter wear. They settled in the small sitting area, mugs warming their hands. So, Jessica began, what's going on? Maggie recounted the conversation about moving, about retirement communities, about being pushed aside yet again. As she spoke, the frustration of months spilled out each small slight, each boundary crossed, each reminder that she was seen not as an equal, but as a burden to be managed. Jessica listened without interrupting, her expression darkening with each new detail. When Maggie finally fell silent, she set down her mug with deliberate care. This is elder abuse, she said flatly. Maggie blinked. That's a bit dramatic. Don't you think they haven't hurt me? Emotional and financial abuse are still abuse. Aunt Maggie, they're isolating you, controlling your environment, making decisions about your life without your input. And now they're trying to force you out of a house you paid for. Jessica leaned forward. Have you talked to a lawyer? Besides the initial consultation with Eleanor. Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first. Good, because there's something else you should know. Jessica hesitated. I overheard Olivia on the phone with Brian last week when I dropped off those books. They were discussing refinancing the house. Refinancing, but my name is on the mortgage. They were talking about adding their names to the deed, then taking out a home equity loan to buy a place in Burlington. Keeping this house as an investment property? Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. They can't do that without my signature. Are you sure? Have you been careful about what you sign, bills, permission slips for the kids? Anything? Maggie thought back over the months, the countless papers that had crossed her path. Had she signed something without reading it carefully? She couldn't be certain. I need to talk to Eleanor, she said. Today. Jessica nodded. I'll drive you over there now, if you want. What about Olivia and Brian? They'll wonder where I've gone. Text them you're having dinner with me, which you are, after we see Eleanor. Maggie hesitated, then nodded. This wasn't a betrayal, she told herself. This was self-preservation. Eleanor's home office was warmer than her professional one, with a fireplace crackling and family photos covering most surfaces, but her expression was all business as she listened to Maggie and Jessica. I warned you, she said finally, removing her reading glasses. Family dynamics and money are a volatile mix. Not helpful, Eleanor. Maggie sighed. What do I do now? Eleanor drummed her fingers on the desk. Let's establish the facts. Your name is on the deed and mortgage, solely. You paid approximately 80% of the down payment. There is no formal agreement about shared ownership or equity division. Correct? Maggie nodded. Then legally, the house is yours. Period. They cannot refinance without your consent, cannot sell without your consent, cannot force you out. But morally, Maggie began. Morally, they've been taking advantage of your generosity for months. Jessica interrupted. You fulfilled your end of the bargain. They've been chipping away at yours. Eleanor nodded in agreement. The question now is what you want to happen. Do you want to continue living with them under clearer boundaries, or do you want them to move out? Maggie hadn't allowed herself to consider the second option. I can't evict my own daughter, especially not with a baby on the way. It wouldn't be immediate, Eleanor explained. We give them reasonable notice 60 days, perhaps, enough time to find alternative housing. With what money? Maggie asked. If I force them out, they'll have nothing. They have income, Jessica pointed out. Brian's new job, Olivia's work. They managed before you sold your house. But the children will adapt, Eleanor said gently. Children are resilient. More importantly, what message do you send them by allowing their parents to treat you this way, that it's acceptable to diminish someone's dignity because of their age? Maggie fell silent, turning the mug in her hands. The truth was, she didn't want to continue living in the current arrangement, but the alternative seemed so drastic, so final. What if there's another option? She said slowly. What if I sell my share to them? They keep the house. I buy something smaller for myself. Eleanor shook her head. They can't afford to buy you out, not without selling, which puts them back at square one. Then what do I do? Maggie's voice cracked, the strain of months finally showing through her carefully maintained composure. Jessica reached across the table and took her hand. You stand up for yourself. You set boundaries with consequences. You remember that loving someone doesn't mean letting them walk all over you. Eleanor nodded. I'll draft a formal notice for them. Not an eviction, not yet, but a clear statement of ownership and expectations. If they comply, great. If not, we escalate. Maggie took a deep breath, then another. The weight that had been pressing on her chest for months seemed to lighten. Just a fraction. Okay, she said. Draft the letter. Maggie returned home after 9, the envelope from Eleanor tucked securely in her purse. The house was quiet, the twins presumably in bed, no sign of Olivia or Brian. She made her way to her suite, intending to hide the document until she found the right moment to present it. But as she passed the kitchen, she heard Brian's voice from the office. It's a straightforward quitclaim deed, he was saying. Once she signs it, we're joint owners, and we can move forward with a refinance. Maggie froze, then silently backed up until she could see through the partially open door. Brian sat at the desk, phone to his ear, a document open on his laptop. No, she doesn't suspect anything, he continued. We'll tell her it's for estate planning purposes, to avoid probate issues. A pause. Of course she'll sign it. She trusts Olivia completely. Maggie's hand tightened on her purse strap. The casual confidence in his voice, the certainty that she would sign away her rights without question, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the January air. We're thinking mid-February for the Burlington house, Brian went on. That gives us time to get her settled somewhere before the baby comes. Another pause. No, not with us. We found a nice senior's place about 20 minutes away. Visiting distance but not living with us distance. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Maggie's feet. They weren't just planning to add their names to the deed. They were planning to move her into a facility to separate her from the house she'd paid for, from her grandchildren, from the life she'd rebuilt after giving up her home. She backed away, careful not to make a sound, and retreated to her suite, inside. She locked the door, something she rarely did, and sank onto the edge of her bed, hands trembling. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a series of thoughtless slights. It was a calculated plan to take advantage of her trust, her resources, her love for her family. She pulled out her phone and dialed Jessica. I heard them, she said, when her niece answered. They're planning to trick me into signing over the house, then put me in a senior's place while they move to Burlington. Jessica's sharp intake of breath was audible. Oh, Aunt Maggie, I can't stay here tonight. I can't face them knowing what they're planning. Come to my apartment, Jessica said immediately. Pack a bag. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Maggie moved methodically, packing essentials as if for a weekend trip clothes, medications, toiletries. She added her important documents, including the folder with the house papers and Eleanor's letter. As an afterthought, she took the framed photo of Richard from her nightstand. Then she wrote a brief note staying with Jessica for a few days. Need some space to think. Mom. She placed it on the kitchen counter where Olivia would find it in the morning, then slipped out the front door into the cold night, locking it behind her with the key she'd rarely used since moving in. Jessica was waiting at the curb, engine running, heater blasting. Maggie slid into the passenger seat, her small suitcase tucked between her feet. Are you okay? Jessica asked, pulling away from the house. Maggie looked back at the brightly lit windows, at the home she'd sacrificed so much to provide. No, she admitted, but I think I will be. Jessica's apartment was small, but welcoming, a one-bedroom in an older building near the university where she was pursuing her graduate degree. The living room sofa converted to a bed, which Jessica insisted Maggie take while she slept on an air mattress on the floor. It's just for a few nights, Maggie protested, until we figure out next steps. Jessica agreed, making up the sofa with clean sheets and extra blankets. They stayed up late, talking through options, scenarios, contingencies. By midnight, exhaustion overtook them both, and they fell into uneasy sleep. Morning brought a flurry of texts and calls from Olivia, each more frantic than the last. Mom, where are you? Why did you leave without telling us we're worried sick? Please call me. If you don't answer, I'm calling the police to report you missing. The last one prompted Maggie to finally respond. I'm fine, staying with Jessica. We'll be in touch soon. Then she silenced her phone and joined Jessica for coffee at the tiny kitchen table. What's the plan for today? Jessica asked, sliding a mug across to her. I need to see Dr. Michaels, Maggie decided. Get a clean bill of health on record in case they try to claim I'm not competent. Smart. Then what? Then I meet with Eleanor again. I want to move forward with a formal notice. Jessica nodded. Do you want me to come with you? No, I need to do this myself. Maggie sipped her coffee, grateful for its warmth, its normalcy. But thank you. For everything. Jessica smiled, reaching across to squeeze her aunt's hand. We're family, real family, not whatever game Olivia and Brian are playing. The day unfolded according to plan. Dr. Meet Michaels, concerned by Maggie's account of recent events, documented her excellent cognitive function and general good health. If anyone tries to claim otherwise, he said, writing a note in her file, send them to me. Eleanor was equally supportive, finalizing the formal notice and arranging for it to be delivered by courier the following day. This gives them 60 days to either sign a proper co-ownership agreement or vacate the premises, she explained. It's generous but firm. And if they refuse, Maggie asked, then we proceed with legal eviction. Eleanor said, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. By evening, Maggie felt both exhausted and oddly energized, as if she'd been carrying a heavy burden for so long that even the act of setting it down was its own form of exertion. Her phone, when she finally checked it, showed 27 missed calls and over 40 text messages, mostly from Olivia. A few from Brian, even one from his mother expressing concern about your state of mind. The last text from Olivia read, I'm coming to Jessica's. We need to talk. It arrived just as a knock sounded at the apartment door. Olivia stood in the hallway, her pregnant belly prominent under her winter coat, her expression a mix of worry and indignation. Mom, she said, pushing past Jessica into the apartment. What is going on? We've been out of our minds with worry. Maggie remained seated at the kitchen table. Hello, Olivia. I left a note. Need space to think isn't an explanation. Olivia snapped, shrugging off her coat. You can't just disappear like that. Not at your age. There it was again, her age, wielded like a weapon. I'm 62, not incompetent, Maggie said calmly. I decided I needed some time away, so I arranged it. Away from what your family, your home. Olivia's voice rose. Is this some kind of episode? Should we be worried about your mental health? Jessica, who had been hovering by the door, stepped forward. That's enough, Olivia. Aunt Maggie is perfectly fine. She's here because she feels unsafe in that house. Unsafe, Olivia repeated, incredulous. In her own family's home? That's ridiculous. Is it? Maggie asked quietly. When your husband is plotting to trick me into signing away my rights to the house I paid for? When you're making plans to ship me off to a nice senior's place while you move to Burlington? Olivia's face drained of color. What are you talking about? I overheard Brian on the phone last night. I know about the quitclaim deed. I know about the refinance plans. I know everything. Olivia sank onto the couch, one hand protectively covering her belly. It's not what you think. Then what is it? Maggie challenged. Explain it to me, Olivia. Explain how it's not a betrayal. We're trying to secure our family's future, Olivia said, defensive now. With the new baby coming, Brian's new job, we need stability. At my expense, you're part of that future. We've always included you in our plans. As what a financial resource, an occasional babysitter, someone to be managed and contained. Maggie's calm was slipping, months of hurt rising to the surface. When was the last time you knocked before entering my space, or asked my opinion on a household decision, or treated me like an adult with agency rather than an aging burden? Olivia's eyes filled with tears. That's not fair. We've given you a home, a place in our family. No, Maggie interrupted. I gave you a home, with my money, my sacrifice. I gave up my independence, my community, my garden, everything I built over decades to help you when you needed it. And how have you repaid that? By gradually erasing me from my own life. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Olivia didn't immediately respond, her gaze fixed on her hands clasped in her lap. We never meant to make you feel that way, she finally said, her voice small. Intention isn't the point, Maggie replied. Impact is, and the impact has been that I no longer feel respected or valued in that house. So what now? Olivia asked. You're just leaving, abandoning us. I'm reclaiming my dignity, Maggie corrected. Tomorrow, you and Brian will receive a formal notice. It gives you 60 days to either sign a proper co-ownership agreement, one that respects my position as primary owner and establishes clear boundaries, or find alternative housing. Olivia's head snapped up. You're evicting us, your own daughter, your grandchildren. I'm enforcing the agreement we should have had from the beginning, Maggie said. The one you and Brian have repeatedly refused to sign? Because it's insulting, we're family, not tenants. Family respects boundaries. Family honors commitments. Family doesn't conspire to strip assets from its most vulnerable members. Olivia stood abruptly. I can't believe you're doing this. After everything we've done for you. What exactly have you done for me? Olivia? Maggie asked quietly. Besides, diminish me at every turn. Olivia had no answer. She gathered her coat, hands shaking. Brian was right. You've changed. Become bitter, paranoid. Maybe you do need help. Maggie didn't rise to the bait. The notice arrives tomorrow. 60 days is generous. I suggest you use it wisely. After Olivia left, the apartment fell into silence. Jessica, who had witnessed the exchange from the kitchen doorway, finally spoke. Are you okay? Maggie nodded slowly. I think I am. For the first time in months. I feel like I can breathe. What happens now, Maggie said. We wait for them to show their true colors. The formal notice arrived at the house by courier the next morning, delivered in a plain manila envelope addressed to Olivia and Brian Bell. Maggie didn't witness its delivery. She remained at Jessica's apartment, preparing herself for the fallout she knew would come. It arrived at 10:17 a.m. in the form of a phone call from Brian, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. What the hell is this? He demanded without preamble. I believe the document is self-explanatory, Maggie replied, her own voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. A 60-day notice to vacate. Are you out of your mind? Papers rustled in the background. After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us. I'm enforcing the terms of our original agreement, the one you and Olivia have consistently avoided formalizing. Brian's laugh was harsh. Original agreement, you mean the vague conversation we had before you moved in? That's not legally binding? No, but the deed is, as is the mortgage, both in my name alone. We've been making the payments, partial payments, Maggie corrected. I've contributed 70% of the mortgage each month, plus utilities, plus groceries. I have the records. Silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. When Brian spoke again, his tone had shifted from outrage to calculation. You won't go through with this. You wouldn't do that to your own family. You were planning to trick me into signing away my rights to the house, then move me into a senior's place while you relocated to Burlington, Maggie said flatly. Don't lecture me about family loyalty. Another pause. You misunderstood what you overheard. Did I then explain the quitclaim deed? Explain the refinance plans? Explain the nice place 20 minutes away where you intended to install me? Brian's sigh was audible. Look, Margaret, we need to discuss this reasonably, like adults. Come home, and we'll sort it out. I'll meet you on neutral ground, Eleanor Wright's office, tomorrow at 2. Bring the co-ownership agreement I proposed 6 months ago, signed and notarized. Or what you'll throw your pregnant daughter into the street. 60 days is hardly into the street, Maggie replied. And I'm confident you'll land on your feet. You always do. especially when using my resources to cushion the fall. She ended the call before he could respond, hands trembling despite her calm words. The confrontation left her feeling simultaneously empowered and deeply sad, a contradiction that seemed to define this new chapter of her life. Jessica appeared in the doorway, concern etching her features. Brian, Maggie nodded, predictably outraged. Attempted guilt, then manipulation, then false reasonableness. What's next? I've suggested a meeting at Eleanor's office tomorrow. We'll see if they show up. Jessica sat beside her on the sofa bed. And if they don't, then the 60-day clock continues ticking, Maggie said, surprising herself with her own resolve. I won't be bullied out of my rights, not again. Eleanor's office was neutral territory only in the technical sense. The walnut paneling, leather chairs, and wall of legal tomes created an atmosphere of authority that clearly intimidated Brian and Olivia as they entered at precisely 2 o'clock the following day. Olivia's eyes were red-rimmed, her hand resting protectively on her expanded belly. Brian wore what Maggie recognized as his business meeting expression, blandly pleasant but calculating. Thank you for coming, Eleanor began, gesturing to the chairs arranged around her desk. I believe we all want to resolve this situation amicably. There's nothing amicable about threatening eviction, Brian said, remaining standing while Olivia lowered herself carefully into a chair. Especially not with a baby due in 6 weeks. Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. The notice isn't a threat, Mr. Bell. It's a legal option. Mrs. Reynolds is entitled to exercise as sole owner of the property. She's acting out of paranoia, Brian countered, imagining conspiracies where there are none. Maggie, seated beside Eleanor, maintained her composure. Did you bring the signed agreement? Brian's hesitation was answer enough. We need to discuss terms first. The one you proposed is one-sided. One-sided? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. It acknowledges Mrs. Reynolds' 80% ownership interest while generously granting you and your wife recognition of the 20% you've contributed. It provides clear guidelines for shared living and decision-making. What exactly is one-sided about that? The fact that she could still force us out at any time? Olivia interjected, her voice thick with emotion. What kind of security is that for our family? The same kind you were planning to offer her, Eleanor replied smoothly. Or was that nice senior's place meant to be permanent? Olivia flushed. You don't understand. We were trying to do what's best for everyone. By making decisions about my life without my input, Maggie asked quietly. By treating me as incompetent because of my age. That's not what we were doing, Brian insisted. I have the documentation that suggests otherwise, Eleanor said, tapping a folder on her desk, including records of your attempt to contact Mrs. Reynolds' physician about her competency. This was news to Maggie, who turned to Eleanor in surprise. The lawyer gave an almost imperceptible nod, confirming that this was not a bluff. Brian's expression hardened. This is ridiculous. We're not signing anything under duress. Then you have 58 days to find alternative housing. Eleanor replied, the notice has been properly served. The timeline is clear. You can't be serious. Olivia's voice broke. Mom, please, think about what you're doing. The twins, the baby, your grandchildren. Maggie felt the familiar twist of guilt, the instinct to concede, to prioritize others' needs above her own dignity. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I have thought about it, she said. For months, while you gradually eroded my independence, questioned my competence, and planned to remove me from a home I paid for. I'm not doing this lightly. Olivia? Then what do you want? Brian demanded. Just tell us what will make this go away, Eleanor interjected before Maggie could respond. My client has been clear about her terms. Sign the co-ownership agreement as presented, with its clearly defined boundaries and acknowledgement of Mrs. Reynolds' majority stake, or vacate within the specified time frame. And if we refuse, Brian challenged, then on day 61, we file for formal eviction, Eleanor said calmly, which will become part of the public record and may impact your ability to rent or purchase property in the future. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Brian and Olivia exchanged glances, a wordless communication from which Maggie was excluded. We need time to consider, Brian said finally. You have 58 days, Eleanor reminded him. I suggest you use them wisely. After they left, Maggie sank back in her chair, emotionally drained. They're not going to sign. Eleanor nodded. Probably not. Men like Brian don't concede power willingly. So what happens now? Now we prepare for phase 2, Eleanor said, reaching for her legal pad, including securing your assets and documenting any attempts at retaliation. Retaliation. Trust me, it's coming. People rarely go quietly when their plans are disrupted. Eleanor's expression softened. Are you still comfortable staying with Jessica? Maggie hesitated. For now, but I can't impose indefinitely. I have a colleague with a furnished guest house. It's available month to month, private entrance, reasonable rent. Would you like me to make inquiries? The idea of a space that was truly hers, even temporarily, felt like a lifeline. Yes, please, Eleanor made a note. In the meantime, we should retrieve your essential belongings from the house. I recommend doing so when Brian and Olivia aren't home, to avoid confrontation. I feel like I'm sneaking around in my own house, Maggie said with a mirthless laugh. Sometimes retreat is the better part of valor, Eleanor replied, especially when you're playing the long game. The following day, Maggie returned to the house with Jessica and Eleanor's assistant, a serious young man named Marcus, who carried the necessary legal paperwork should anyone question their right to be there. The house was empty. As expected, Olivia at work, Brian at his new job in Burlington, the twins at school. It felt both familiar and alien, like returning to a childhood home after decades away. They worked efficiently, focusing on Maggie's most important possessions, financial records, family heirlooms, clothing, medications. Jessica photographed each item they took, creating a detailed inventory to prevent later accusations of theft. In her suite, Maggie paused before the small bookshelf where Richard's urn had sat since the move. She wrapped it carefully in a soft throw, then placed it in the padded box Jessica had brought specifically for this purpose. I should have never left you here, she murmured to the urn. I'm sorry. The garden tools were next: secateurs, trowels, gardening gloves worn soft with use, then her mother's recipe box, photo albums, the quilt her grandmother had made, books with marginalia dating back decades. Each item represented not just material value but memory, identity, connection to a past that Olivia and Brian had seemed determined to erase. As they were loading the last box into Jessica's car, a neighbor approached from across the street, Mrs. Peterson, a retired nurse who had brought cookies when they first moved in. Maggie, is everything all right? Her gaze shifted between the boxes and Maggie's face, concern evident. Just retrieving some personal items, Maggie explained, keeping her tone light. I'm staying with my niece for a while. Mrs. Peterson's expression turned knowing. I heard raised voices the other night. Your son-in-law has quite the projection. Maggie felt a flash of embarrassment, then remembered Eleanor's advice. No shame in standing up for yourself. We're working through some family matters, she said diplomatically. Well, if you need anything, a friendly ear, a cup of coffee, I'm just across the street. Mrs. Peterson squeezed her arm. Us older gals have to stick together. Right. The genuine warmth in the gesture nearly undid Maggie's composure. Thank you. I might take you up on that. As they drove away, Jessica glanced at her aunt. You okay? Maggie nodded, watching the house recede in the side mirror. It's just strange. Leaving again. Feels like I'm always the one walking away, even when I'm not the one in the wrong. You're not walking away, Jessica corrected. You're walking towards something better. There's a difference. Eleanor's colleague's guest house proved to be a small but elegant cottage behind a Victorian home in the historic district. One bedroom, an efficiency kitchen, a sitting area with built-in bookshelves, and best of all, a secluded garden space with raised beds currently dormant under winter mulch. It's perfect, Maggie told the owner, a retired judge named Harriet, who showed her around with brisk efficiency. Eleanor said you might need it for a few months, Harriet said. Something about reclaiming property from ungrateful progeny. Maggie smiled despite herself. Something like that. Well, the lease is month to month, first and last due at signing, utilities included. Harriet handed her a single key on a silver fob. No smoking, no wild parties, garden privileges included. I'm away most weekends, so you'll have the place to yourself. The rent was reasonable, especially given the location and furnishings. Maggie signed the lease that afternoon and moved in the same day, arranging her rescued possessions with care. Richard's urn took its place on the mantel above the small fireplace. Her gardening tools found a home in a wicker basket by the back door. By evening, the cottage felt more like home than her suite in the house ever had. She sat in the small armchair by the window, watching darkness settle over the garden, and felt something unfurl in her chest, a tension she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Her phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. We need to talk, face to face, Please. Maggie considered ignoring it, then reconsidered. Bridges were being burned, but perhaps not all needed to be reduced to ash. I'm willing to meet. Public place only. Coffee shop on Main St. tomorrow at 11. Olivia's reply came quickly. I'll be there. Maggie set down her phone, trying to anticipate the conversation ahead. Would Olivia try manipulation again? Guilt, anger? Or was there a possibility, however slim, of genuine understanding? She had no illusions that one conversation would resolve the deep fractures in their relationship, but perhaps it could establish a new foundation, one built on respect rather than convenience, on boundaries rather than exploitation. That night, she slept better than she had in months, lulled by the unfamiliar but welcome silence of a space that was truly her own. The coffee shop on Main Street was busy enough to ensure privacy through ambient noise, but not so crowded that they couldn't find a quiet table in the corner. Maggie arrived early, ordering her usual black coffee with a splash of cream and securing a spot away from the main traffic flow. Olivia arrived at precisely 11, her pregnant silhouette unmistakable even before she navigated through the maze of tables. She looked tired, Maggie thought, the kind of bone-deep weariness that transcended normal third trimester fatigue. Mom, she said, lowering herself carefully into the chair opposite. Thank you for meeting me. Maggie nodded, watching as Olivia ordered herbal tea from the passing server. You wanted to talk. Olivia cradled her belly with both hands, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on Maggie. I've been thinking about what you said, about feeling erased, diminished. And I think maybe there's some truth to it. Olivia met her gaze directly for the first time. Not intentionally, not consciously, but looking back at these past months, she trailed off, accepting the tea from the server with a murmured thanks. Maggie waited, unwilling to fill the silence with reassurances or concessions. This was Olivia's moment to step up, to acknowledge the patterns that had led them here. I didn't see it, Olivia continued finally. How we were treating you, the small comments, the decisions made without your input, it just seemed efficient, practical. Practical for whom? Maggie asked quietly. Olivia flinched. For us, I guess, which is exactly your point. She stirred her tea, though she'd added nothing to it. I'm not saying you're wrong to be upset. I'm just trying to explain that we weren't being malicious. Intent isn't magic. Olivia, it doesn't erase impact. I know that now. Olivia looked up, her eyes glistening. But does it have to come to this eviction legal battles? We're family. There it was again, the invocation of family ties, as if they trumped all other considerations, as if family were a get-out-of-consequences-free card. Yes, we're family, Maggie agreed, which is why your actions hurt so deeply. Family should be the last people to undermine your dignity, not the first. Olivia's shoulders slumped. What do you want, Mom? Really is it the house control? What a respect, Maggie said simply. Recognition of my autonomy. Acknowledgement that I'm a full person with rights and feelings, not just a convenient resource or an aging problem to be managed. And the only way to get that is through legal action, through threatening to make us homeless. The legal action became necessary when reasonable conversations failed, when boundaries were repeatedly crossed. When I discovered you and Brian plotting to trick me out of my rights to the house, Maggie leaned forward. And let's be clear, 60 days notice with your combined incomes is hardly homeless. It's an inconvenience, one you created by refusing to honor our original agreement. Olivia's expression hardened. So that's it? No compromise, no middle ground. I offered the middle ground 6 months ago, a formal co-ownership agreement that respected everyone's contributions and established clear boundaries. You and Brian refused to sign it because it gave you ultimate authority over the house. Because it acknowledged reality, Maggie corrected. I paid 80% of the cost. My name is on the deed and mortgage. Those are facts, not opinions. They had reached an impasse, both women staring at each other across a divide that seemed to widen with each exchange. Finally, Olivia sighed. Brian won't agree to your terms. He's already talking to a lawyer about challenging the notice. That's his right, Maggie said calmly. But it won't change the legal reality. And what about the human reality, Mom? The twins asking why Grandma left the baby who might not know you. Olivia's voice broke. Is this really how you want it to end? Maggie felt the familiar twist of guilt, the weight of expectations that had burdened her for decades. But beneath it, stronger now, was the certainty that she was fighting for something essential. This isn't about ending anything, she said, is about establishing a new relationship, one based on mutual respect rather than convenience. If that means physical distance for a while, so be it. Olivia stood abruptly, gathering her coat. You've changed, Mom. Become harder, colder. No, Maggie replied, remaining seated. I've simply stopped accepting less than I deserve. After Olivia left, Maggie sat alone, finishing her coffee as it cooled. The conversation had gone as expected. No breakthroughs, no sudden understanding. Just the same circular arguments rooted in fundamentally different perceptions of what had occurred between them. She felt both validated and deeply sad. Validated that she was standing up for herself. Sad that it had come to this legal notices and public confrontations with her only daughter. As she gathered her things to leave, she noticed a familiar figure at the counter. Dr. Patricia Chen, the doctor Olivia had tried to assign to her without consultation. Dr. Chen turned, coffee in hand, and recognized Maggie. After a moment's hesitation, she approached. Mrs. Reynolds Patricia Chen, we've never formally met, but Olivia mentioned you. Maggie finished for her, keeping her tone neutral. Dr. Chen nodded. I hope you don't mind my saying so, but I'm glad you didn't switch to my practice. This was unexpected. Oh, your daughter contacted me with concerns about your cognitive function. Asked if I could evaluate you without your knowledge during what she described as a routine checkup. Dr. Chen's expression was carefully professional, but disapproval radiated from her posture. I declined, of course. It would have been unethical. Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. When was this? About 3 weeks ago. Dr. Chen hesitated. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but as a doctor who specializes in elder care, I've seen too many capable seniors undermined by well-meaning but controlling family members. It's a form of abuse that often goes unrecognized. Thank you for your honesty, Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Chen nodded once, then moved toward the exit. Take care of yourself, Mrs. Reynolds. Alone again. Maggie processed this new information. 3 weeks ago, around the time Brian had begun discussing the Burlington job and the potential move, they hadn't just been planning to trick her into signing away her rights. They'd been laying groundwork to question her competence if she refused. The realization hardened her resolve. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a series of thoughtless slights. It was calculated, systematic, and deeply betraying. She pulled out her phone and called Eleanor. The following weeks unfolded in a pattern of legal maneuvers and emotional skirmishes. As Olivia had predicted, Brian consulted a lawyer who sent a formal letter challenging the notice to vacate on various technicalities. Eleanor dispatched a response dismantling each argument with clinical precision. Meanwhile, Maggie settled into her temporary home at Harriet's guest cottage. She planted early spring bulbs in the raised beds, joined the local library, and reconnected with old friends who had fallen away during her months of isolation in the in-law suite. Eleanor's updates continued. Brian and Olivia had attempted to refinance the house, but were denied without Maggie's signature. They'd approached another attorney, seeking a different opinion, but received the same conclusion: Maggie's legal position was unassailable. The calendar pages turned. February gave way to March, bringing slightly warmer days, and the first crocuses pushing through winter-hardened soil. Jessica visited regularly, bringing news from mutual acquaintances and updates about her graduate studies. One evening, as they shared a simple dinner in the cottage, she mentioned seeing the twins at the grocery store with Brian. They asked about you, Jessica reported, helping herself to more salad. Wanted to know when you're coming home. Maggie's heart clenched. What did Brian say? Nothing helpful. Changed the subject. Jessica hesitated. They miss you, Aunt Maggie. I miss them too, Maggie admitted. But this isn't about them. I know, but they're collateral damage in an adult conflict they don't understand. Jessica set down her fork. What if you could see them without Olivia and Brian neutral territory, like the park or a movie? Maggie considered this. Would they allow it? They might not have a choice soon. Ethan's birthday is next week. He specifically asked if you'd be there. The reminder sent a pang through Maggie's chest. Ethan, the more sensitive of the twins, had always been especially close to her. The thought of missing his birthday celebration hurt deeply. I could send a gift, she suggested, knowing even as she spoke that it was an inadequate substitute for presents. Jessica gave her a look that needed no interpretation. Or you could call Brian, propose a compromise, limited contact with the kids, no discussion of the legal situation. Maggie sighed. He'd use it as leverage, try to get me to back down. Probably, Jessica agreed. But isn't seeing the twins worth navigating some manipulation? The question lingered long after Jessica left. Was she allowing principle to overshadow relationship? Was standing firm on her legal rights worth the cost in family connections? No easy answers presented themselves. But the next morning, Maggie found herself dialing Brian's number before she could talk herself out of it. Margaret, he answered, his tone wary. What can I do for you? The formality stung, but wasn't surprising. I understand it's Ethan's birthday next week. I'd like to see him and Emma. A pause. That might be difficult, given the current circumstances. I'm proposing a truce, Maggie said, just for the birthday. No discussion of legal matters, no attempts to use the children as leverage, simply a grandmother who wants to celebrate her grandson turning 13. Brian's sigh was audible. And if I refuse another legal notice, more threats. This isn't a negotiation. Brian, it's a request from one adult to another to put the children's needs first, just for one day. Another long pause. I'll discuss it with Olivia. Thank you. Maggie hesitated, then added, How is she? The pregnancy? Fine, Brian replied stiffly. Due in 2 weeks. The conversation ended shortly after, neither warm nor completely hostile. Maggie set down the phone, uncertain whether she'd made progress or simply opened herself to more manipulation. The answer came that evening in a text from Olivia. Ethan's party is Saturday, 2 p.m. at Cascade Bowling Alley. You're welcome to attend for cake and presents. A limited invitation excluding her from the main celebration, but an invitation nonetheless. Maggie accepted with a simple, thank you. I'll be there. Progress, she decided, small, grudging, but progress nonetheless. Cascade Bowling Alley buzzed with the chaotic energy of preteens on sugar highs and competitive streaks. Maggie arrived at precisely 3:30, the time Olivia had specified for cake and presents, clutching a carefully wrapped package containing the vintage comic books Ethan had been coveting. She spotted them easily, a cluster of adults watching a group of boys at lanes 7 and 8. Olivia sat on a plastic chair, her pregnancy now at full term, while Brian distributed pizza slices to hungry bowlers. Emma saw her first, breaking away from her own friends to rush across the room. Grandma. The hug was fierce, genuine, a balm to Maggie's bruised heart. Hello, sweetheart. I've missed you. Where have you been? Emma demanded, still holding tight. Dad said you needed space, but that's dumb. There's lots of space at home. It's complicated, honey, Maggie said, smoothing Emma's hair. But I'm here now. Ethan approached more cautiously, torn between teenage dignity and genuine emotion. Hey, Grandma. Maggie opened her free arm, and he stepped into the embrace, his gangly frame suddenly seeming younger than his 13 years. Happy birthday, Ethan. I brought you something. His eyes lit up at the package. Can I open it now? That's what presents are for. Maggie smiled, releasing both children to watch as Ethan tore into the wrapping paper. His gasp of delight was worth every moment of awkwardness. No way, original Spider-Man issues. These are collector's items. My friend Eleanor's son was selling his collection, Maggie explained. When I saw these, I knew they had your name on them. Ethan hugged her again, the comics clutched protectively in one hand. This is awesome. Wait till I show Jaden. He raced off to share his treasure with friends, leaving Maggie with Emma, who seemed reluctant to return to her own group. Are you coming home soon? She asked, her voice small. It's weird without you. Mom cries a lot, and Dad's always on the phone with lawyers. Maggie's heart sank. Despite her best efforts to shield the children, they were absorbing the tension, the conflict, the fracturing of their family unit. I don't know, sweetheart, she answered honestly. Your parents and I need to work some things out. Is it because they were mean to you? Emma asked with the direct insight of a 12-year-old. I heard them talking about your doctor and making you move somewhere else. The confirmation that even the children had picked up on the plans stung afresh. It's more complicated than that, but I want you to know that none of this is your fault, and I love you and Ethan very much. Even if you don't live with us anymore, especially then, Maggie assured her. Their conversation was interrupted by Brian's approach, his expression a careful mask of civility. Cake time, he told Emma, then turned to Maggie. Glad you could make it. The forced politeness was better than outright hostility. Maggie supposed, Thank you for allowing me to come. It means a lot to Ethan. And to me. Brian nodded stiffly. Olivia's over there. She's, well, ninth month. Maggie followed his gesture to where Olivia sat, looking uncomfortable and exhausted. After a moment's hesitation, she approached her daughter. You look ready, she observed, taking the seat beside her. Olivia's smile was strained. More than ready. This one's riding lower than the twins did. An awkward silence fell between them, filled with unspoken accusations and unexpressed grief. Finally, Olivia sighed. Thank you for coming. Ethan wouldn't stop asking if you'd be here. I wouldn't have missed it, Maggie said. How are you holding up with everything? Olivia's eyes welled suddenly. It's a lot. The pregnancy, the house situation, the twins asking questions I don't know how to answer. She wiped at her eyes. I never thought we'd end up here. Neither did I, Maggie admitted. But we still have choices about where we go from here. Do we? Because it feels like you've made all the decisions already? Before Maggie could respond, a commotion from the bowling lanes drew their attention. Cake was being wheeled out, 13 candles blazing atop chocolate frosting. The moment for deeper conversation had passed. As the gathered children sang, "Happy Birthday," Maggie watched Ethan's face glow with excitement and felt both present and oddly detached, a visitor to a celebration she should have helped plan, a spectator in what had once been her family's inner circle. When it was time to leave, both twins hugged her fiercely, extracting promises to visit again soon. Brian nodded a curt goodbye. Olivia, struggling to rise from her chair, accepted Maggie's offered hand with grudging gratitude. Take care of yourself, Maggie said, the words inadequate for all she wanted to express. Olivia nodded, one hand on her belly. You too, Mom. In the parking lot, Maggie sat in her car for long minutes before starting the engine, processing the complex emotions of the afternoon, grief for what had been lost, joy at reconnecting with the twins, uncertainty about the path forward. No easy answers had presented themselves, but a door had cracked open just slightly, and that was something to build upon. The call came at 2:17 a.m., 3 days later, jolting Maggie from deep sleep. Jessica's name flashed on the screen. Aunt Maggie, Olivia's in labor. They're at Memorial Hospital. Maggie sat up, instantly alert. Is everything okay? I think so. The twins called me because they couldn't reach you. Jessica paused. They want you to come. The twins do, or Olivia does. The twins for sure. Olivia, I don't know, but they wouldn't have called if she'd explicitly forbidden it. Maggie was already reaching for clothes, her mind racing. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Can you meet me? Already on my way? The hospital's maternity wing was quiet at this hour, the reception desk staffed by a single nurse who directed them to the waiting area on the third floor. There they found the twins, still in pajamas under hastily donned coats, slumped against each other in uncomfortable chairs. Grandma, Emma exclaimed, jolting awake at their approach. You came. Of course I came, Maggie said, gathering both children into a hug. How long has your mom been in labor? Since dinner, Ethan reported. But it got really bad around midnight. Dad brought us here, but said we have to stay in the waiting room. Any news? Emma shook her head. Dad texts sometimes, but doesn't say much. Maggie settled into a chair beside them, prepared for a long wait. Jessica distributed vending machine snacks and bottles of water, then curled up in her own chair, eyes already drooping. The hours crawled by. Dawn broke outside the windows, pale light filtering through blinds. Hospital staff changed shifts, nodding sympathetically at the waiting family. The twins dozed fitfully, heads resting on Maggie's shoulders. At 7:42 a.m., Brian appeared in the doorway, exhaustion etched into every line of his face, but eyes bright with wonder. It's a girl, he announced. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, everyone's healthy. The twins erupted in cheers, suddenly fully awake. Jessica offered congratulations. Maggie stood, uncertain of her place in this moment of family celebration. Can we see her? Emma demanded. Brian nodded. Your mom's asking for you. Room 312. The twins raced toward the hallway, but Brian remained, his gaze fixed on Maggie. Thank you for coming, he said formally. The kids were worried. Of course, Maggie replied. Congratulations, Brian. I'm truly happy for you and Olivia. He hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. Would you like to see the baby? Olivia's exhausted, but she said it would be okay. The olive branch, however tentative, caught Maggie by surprise. I'd love to. They walked in silence to room 312, where the twins were already gathered around Olivia's bed, exclaiming over the tiny bundle in her arms. Maggie hesitated in the doorway, unwilling to intrude on the intimate family tableau. Olivia looked up, her face drawn with exhaustion, but radiant with new motherhood. Their eyes met across the room, daughter and mother. New life and old wounds. The complicated tangle of love and hurt that defined their relationship. After a long moment, Olivia nodded slightly. Mom, come meet your granddaughter. Maggie approached the bed, throat tight with emotion. The infant was perfect, a shock of dark hair, pink cheeks, tiny fists curled against the hospital blanket. She's beautiful, Maggie whispered, barely trusting her voice. We're naming her Grace, Olivia said softly. After Grandma. The gesture naming the baby after Maggie's mother pierced straight to her heart. She would have been honored, Maggie managed. As am I. Olivia's smile was tired but genuine. Would you like to hold her with reverent care? Maggie accepted the warm bundle, cradling her newest grandchild close. Grace yawned, tiny pink mouth stretching in a perfect O, then settled back to sleep, utterly trusting in her grandmother's arms. The legal battles, the hurt feelings, the uncertain future all receded in the face of this new life, this continuation of family in its most fundamental form. She has your nose, Maggie observed, tracing a gentle finger along the baby's profile. And Richard's chin. Olivia's eyes filled with tears. I wish he could have met her. He would have adored her, Maggie said with certainty, just as he adored you. The moment stretched between them, fragile but hopeful. Not reconciliation, not yet, but a reminder of what connected them beyond the recent conflicts, blood and history, memory and love, the unbreakable threads that bound them even when the fabric of their relationship was torn. When Maggie finally handed Grace back to Olivia, something had shifted subtly in the room's atmosphere. Not resolution, but possibility. A door cracked open wider. We should let you rest, she said, gathering her purse. Congratulations again, to both of you. She's perfect. Brian nodded. I'll walk you out. In the hallway, away from Olivia and the children, he cleared his throat awkwardly. Look, Margaret, about the house situation. Not now, Maggie interrupted gently. This is a day for celebration, not negotiation. I just wanted to say, he persisted, that we've been looking at apartments near my new job. The notice expires next week, and we don't want complications. The acknowledgement that they were preparing to comply with the notice came as a surprise. I appreciate that, Maggie said carefully. We found a 3-bedroom that would work until we can save for something more permanent. Brian continued. It's not what we planned, but he shrugged, the gesture conveying both resignation and determination. I'm glad, Maggie said sincerely. And I want you to know that my issues were never with the children. I'd like to maintain a relationship with them. If you and Olivia are amenable, Brian nodded slowly. Ethan and Emma would like that, and Grace. Well, she should know her grandmother. It wasn't a declaration of peace, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement that relationships could continue even as living arrangements changed, a starting point, if not a resolution. Thank you, Brian, Maggie said, for letting me be here today. He nodded again, already turning back toward Olivia's room. Jessica has our new address. Once we're settled, maybe you could visit. With that, he was gone, leaving Maggie in the hospital hallway with a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully name. Relief that the legal battle might end without further escalation, sadness for the rift that remained, hope for a future that might include her grandchildren, if not the close family unit she'd once envisioned. Jessica appeared at her side. Everything okay? Maggie nodded, surprising herself with the truth of it. Yes, I think maybe it is. The day the moving trucks arrived at the house, Maggie stayed away. She'd received a formal notification from Brian and Olivia's lawyer confirming their compliance with the notice to vacate, along with a request for a walkthrough once the property was empty. Eleanor accompanied her for the inspection, clipboard in hand, professional mask firmly in place. The house echoed with emptiness, footsteps loud on bare floors, walls marked where furniture had once stood. In what had been the twins' rooms, ghostly outlines of posters remained on paint. The master bedroom's closet held a single wire hanger, forgotten in the rush. The kitchen drawers contained scattered utensils deemed not worth packing. Maggie moved through the spaces slowly, cataloging damage minimal and abandonment considerable. The garden had been left untouched, her transplanted rosebush struggling but alive in the corner Brian had reluctantly ceded to her. Everything seems in order, Eleanor pronounced, checking final items on her list. A few nail holes, some scuff marks, nothing beyond normal wear and tear. Maggie nodded, finding herself in the doorway of what had been her suite. The small space felt larger without her possessions, the afternoon light streaming through windows no one had bothered to clean. What will you do with the house? Eleanor asked, closing her clipboard. I don't know yet, Maggie admitted. Sell it, probably. Too many memories now. Most of them complicated. You could rent it out, generate some income. Perhaps. Maggie moved toward the front door, ready to leave. For now, I just want to close this chapter. Outside, spring had fully arrived. The yard lush with new growth neither she nor Olivia's family had planted, nature reclaiming space, indifferent to human conflicts. They left the key under the mat, Eleanor reported, retrieving it. And a note. Maggie accepted the folded paper, recognizing Olivia's handwriting. She tucked it into her pocket without reading it. I'll look at it later. Later came that evening, in the quiet of Harriet's guest cottage, a glass of wine at her elbow, and Richard's urn keeping silent company from the mantel. Mom, the note began. We're leaving as required. The new address is enclosed. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, the door is open. Not the same door, not the same relationship, but open nonetheless. Olivia, Brian, and family. Not an apology, not quite, but an acknowledgement of change, of consequence, of the possibility of connection without the entanglement that had caused such harm. Maggie folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer of her bedside table. Then she opened her laptop and began searching for properties not to rent, not to share, but to own. A home of her own, sized appropriately for a woman of 62 who had rediscovered her worth. A week later, she placed an offer on a small craftsman bungalow 3 neighborhoods away from the house she'd left behind. 2 bedrooms, a sunroom perfect for reading, and most importantly, a garden with southern exposure ideal for roses that needed room to grow. The offer was accepted, a new beginning, rooted in the hard-won wisdom of the past year. Summer arrived with scorching heat and the scent of freshly cut grass. Maggie's new home had taken shape around her familiar furniture, arranged in unfamiliar rooms, old photographs in new frames, beloved books on built-in shelves she'd commissioned from a local carpenter. The garden bloomed with transplants from Harriet's cottage and new acquisitions from the local nursery. The struggling rose bush from the old house had been carefully relocated and now thrived in full sun, its crimson blooms a testament to resilience. Jessica visited often, sometimes staying in the second bedroom Maggie had decorated specifically for her. Eleanor dropped by with legal updates, the house now officially on the market. The co-ownership agreement formally dissolved, all ties between Maggie and Brian's finances severed. But the most significant visits came on alternate Sundays, when Ethan and Emma arrived for what they called Grandma Day. Sometimes Brian dropped them off, sometimes Olivia. The exchanges brief but increasingly civil as weeks passed. Occasionally, they brought Grace, now 3 months old and alert to the world around her. On those days, Maggie would sit in the garden with her youngest grandchild, pointing out butterflies and explaining the names of flowers to ears too young to understand, but present nonetheless. The relationship with Olivia remained strained but not severed. They spoke when necessary, mainly about the children. The deeper wounds remained unaddressed, but time was beginning to scab over the raw edges. One Sunday in late July, as Maggie prepared lunch for the twins' visit, her doorbell rang 15 minutes earlier than expected. She opened it to find not just Ethan and Emma, but Olivia as well. Grace cradled in her arms. I hope you don't mind, Olivia said hesitantly. The kids wanted me to see your new place. Maggie stepped back, opening the door wider. Of course, come in. The twins raced past, already familiar with the house's layout, heading straight for the kitchen, where chocolate chip cookies cooled on a rack. It's lovely, Olivia commented, taking in the cozy living room with its comfortable furniture and personal touches. Very you. Thank you, Maggie replied, uncertain how to navigate this unexpected visit. Would you like some tea or lemonade? It's fresh. Lemonade would be nice. They settled in the sunroom, Grace sleeping peacefully in her carrier between them. Through the windows, the garden blazed with summer-colored daylilies, black-eyed Susans, the roses in their second bloom of the season. Your garden is beautiful, Olivia observed. I always envied your green thumb. You could have it too, with practice, Maggie said. It's mostly patience and paying attention. Olivia smiled faintly. 2 qualities I've never had in abundance. The conversation meandered through safe topics: Grace's development, the twins' summer activities, the unusually hot weather. Neither woman broached the deeper issues that had divided them, the wounds still too tender for casual probing. But as the afternoon progressed, something eased between them, not forgiveness, exactly, but a tentative acceptance of their new reality. Separate lives intersecting through the children, boundaries clearly established, but not impenetrable. When it was time for them to leave, Olivia hesitated at the door. Mom, I've been thinking. Would you want to have dinner sometime, just us, to talk properly? The invitation surprised Maggie. I like that, she said cautiously. I can't promise it will fix everything, Olivia added. But maybe we could start understanding each other better. Understanding would be a good beginning, Maggie agreed. After they left, she returned to the garden, deadheading spent blooms and staking plants bent by recent rain. The physical work soothed her as it always had, allowing her mind to process the unexpected turn in her relationship with Olivia. No illusions of instant reconciliation clouded her thoughts. The damage done was too significant for simple solutions, but perhaps, like the struggling rosebush now flourishing in proper soil and sunlight, their relationship could be transplanted into healthier ground rooted in respect rather than convenience, in boundaries rather than exploitation. She knelt beside the roses, pruning shears in hand, and noticed new growth emerging from what had seemed a dead branch, tiny leaves unfurling, reaching toward light, defying expectations of decay. Life finding a way forward, as it always did when given proper care and room to grow. Maggie smiled, making a clean cut just above the new growth. Sometimes healing required sharp edges and decisive action. Sometimes the kindest thing you could do was create space for something better to emerge. She rose, brushing soil from her knees, and looked around at the garden she'd created, not a replica of what she'd lost, but something new built on the foundation of experience. Half a plate, she murmured to herself, recalling the dinner that had crystallized her awakening nearly a year before. Full of dignity, the phrase felt right a summation of her journey from acceptance to assertion, from diminishment to reclamation. She hadn't wanted conflict, hadn't sought division. She had simply, finally, demanded the full measure of respect she deserved, and in that demand, she had found not just a house of her own, but a home within herself, one that could not be reduced, controlled, or taken away. Some wars end with surrender, others with triumph. This one ends with a garden roses blooming where they were never expected to survive, their thorns as essential as their petals. I sold my home once to keep my family afloat, only to discover I was slowly drowning in the very waters I'd provided. They measured my portions, scheduled my showers, and planned my removal with the same casual efficiency they used to organize the pantry. Family, they said, as if the word itself excused every boundary crossed. The hardest battle wasn't the legal notices or the confrontations. It was silencing that voice inside the one that whispers a mother should always sacrifice, that dignity is a luxury age can't afford, that loneliness is worse than erasure. My new garden is smaller now, the house too, but the air moves freely here, carrying the scent of decisions that belong entirely to me. My grandchildren visit on alternating Sundays. My daughter and I speak in careful sentences that might, someday, rebuild into conversations. I lost a house but reclaimed myself. Sometimes we must prune what we love most deeply, cutting back to healthy growth, understanding that true nurturing requires both compassion and boundaries, and that the most profound acts of love often begin with the quiet courage to say, "This plate is not enough.